Who were those men who left everything behind, their lands, their families, to march thousands of miles toward Jerusalem? The desert sands burned beneath their feet, crosses fluttered in the wind, and the heavens seemed to weigh every battle. Tonight, let history's echoes guide you through the First Four Crusades. Settle in and welcome to Twilight Tales. Chapter 1. The Call of God and Destiny. Part 1. The West in Ferment. At the dawn of the 11th century, Christian Europe slowly awakens from a long slumber of fears and famines. The countryside, once nothing but desolate fields and scattered villages, is gradually covered with golden wheat and vineyards. Church steeples rise toward the sky, timid yet fervent, like prayers of stone. The masses, still marked by the harshness of past centuries, seek in faith a light that transcends the misery of their days. Pilgrimages multiply. Men and women, poor or lords, leave their lands to walk toward Rome, Compostela, or even further, Jerusalem, the distant city whose name resonates like a promise. They carry with them fatigue, diseases, and the wounds of the roads, but also the conviction that each step brings them closer to God. For many, reaching a sanctuary, embracing a relic, seeing the Holy Land with their own eyes, is to touch eternity. But the West is not only a world of fervor, it is also a world of conflicts and contradictions. Knights, children of steel, wander through a landscape of private wars, sometimes plundering the very lands they swear to defend. Christian blood is often spilled by Christian hands. Lords vie for castles, villages, and roads as if they were fleeting treasures, and yet, amid this violence, an idea grows, that of a war fought not only for the honor of a lineage or the wealth of a fief, but for God himself. Clerics, guardians of scriptures and souls, observe this tumult with concern. In their monasteries, within thick walls where the chant of monks resonates, they pray for peace. But some among them see, in the turmoil of the times, an opportunity to direct the knight's energy toward a higher cause. If war is inevitable, would it not be better for it to be waged against the enemies of the faith rather than against Christ's brothers? In the East, the stories brought back by pilgrims stir unease. Many report being extorted, mistreated, or prevented from reaching holy sites. Jerusalem, the sacred city, is under Muslim rule. The caliphs and sultans who succeed one another there sometimes allow Christians to enter, sometimes drive them out. This uncertainty fuels anger, and this anger intertwines with fervor. In seigneurial courts, amidst feasts where wine flows and minstrels sing, the name of Jerusalem spreads like a legend. Knights imagine glorious battles under the eastern sun, banners snapping in the wind before gleaming walls, relics wrested from the hands of infidels, the most pious envision martyrdom, the most ambitious glimpse kingdoms to conquer. The people, meanwhile, live in constant tension between the harshness of daily life and the hope of a better world. Famines still strike, epidemics carry off entire families, but sermons preached in churches kindle a burning flame in hearts. There exists a heavenly Jerusalem promised to the faithful, and perhaps walking toward the earthly Jerusalem is the path to it. Kings themselves, though still weak and often challenged by their vassals, understand that this agitation can be a force for uniting peoples under a single banner, a single ideal. is to give new meaning to centuries of division. In cities, fields, and cloisters, a murmur begins to circulate. This murmur takes root in the fear of the Last Judgment, in the vision of a world at the end of its cycle, where every soul must prepare to render account. The year 1000 has left traces of terror, and many believe the end is near. Thus, fighting for the tomb of Christ is to prepare to face God's gaze with pride. The West is in ferment. Between fervor and violence, between faith and the appetite for glory, an unstoppable movement is born. In monasteries, abbots counsel princes to channel their arms toward the east. In the countryside, priests inflame the masses with tales of suffering and injustice in the Holy Land. In castles, knights sharpen their blades, ready to abandon local quarrels for a cause that seems to transcend them. The air of the time is charged with omens. Shooting stars cross the sky, interpreted as signs from God. Mystical visions stir both the simple and the powerful. Chronicles speak of crosses appearing in the firmament, of springs beginning to flow where the earth was dry. All these signs feed the anticipation of a great upheaval, and amid this tumult, a figure prepares to raise his voice, a voice that will call for unity, sacrifice, and hope, a voice that will transform the destiny of Europe and the Near East. It is in this tension between fear of the end times and hope for salvation that the history of the Crusades takes root. A harsh, wounded world, yet vibrant with faith and dreams. A world that soon will set out on the march toward Jerusalem. Part 2. The Pope's Call. The year is 1095. Winter approaches, and in the lands of Auvergne, a sharp cold settles in, chilling forests and valleys. In Clermont, a city at the heart of France, an extraordinary gathering is being organized. Crowds of pilgrims, peasants, lords, and knights converge on the city, drawn by the rumor of a council summoned by the successor of St. Peter, Pope Urban II. In the crowded streets, voices mingle, accents from various provinces intertwine. Monks in coarse robes, knights in armor, entire families come to hear the pontifical word. Word spreads that a message of utmost importance will be proclaimed, a call that could change the destiny of the Christian world. In the days leading up to the event, bishops and abbots gather under the Pope's authority. They discuss church reforms, clerical discipline, and abuses to be corrected. But behind these matters lies a more pressing urgency. Byzantium calls for help. Emperor Alexios Komnenos, threatened by the Seljuk Turks, has sent messengers imploring the West for aid. The pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem have become perilous, and the Holy Land seems to slip further from the hands of the faithful with each passing day. On the morning of November 27th, a vast assembly gathers outside the city, for its walls cannot contain the immense crowd. A wooden platform is erected. The Pope, an energetic old man with a grave face, steps forward slowly. His eyes shine with an inner flame. Around him, cardinals, bishops, and abbots stand in silence. A chill breeze sweeps the plain, but all hold their breath, hanging on the lips of the Vicar of Christ. Then Urban II raises his hand and speaks. His voice is strong, clear, and carries far in the cold air. He begins by recounting the suffering of Eastern Christians, their churches destroyed, their sanctuaries desecrated. He describes the violence endured by pilgrims, extorted, wounded, sometimes massacred. Each word strikes the assembly like an invisible sword. Murmurs ripple through the crowd. Some weep, others clench their fists. Then he appeals to the knighthood. You, sons of God, you who have been trained to wield arms, turn your lances from the chests of your brothers. Let your quarrels cease. Instead of fighting for paltry fiefs, march together under the banner of the cross. He promises those who join this expedition a full pardon of their sins, a plenary indulgence. For a world obsessed with the salvation of the soul, this promise resonates like deliverance. Knights, burdened by the weight of spilled blood, see a path to redemption open before them. The Pope describes Jerusalem as the city of Christ, the spiritual center of the world, fallen into the hands of infidels. Where the Savior suffered and conquered death, the enemies of the cross stand as masters, he proclaims. His words paint searing images. The Holy Sepulchre profaned, Christ's relics trampled underfoot. The speech becomes visionary. Urban speaks of the East as a rich land, abounding in milk and honey, waiting to be liberated. This is not merely a war, but an armed pilgrimage, a sacred march toward the Lord's tomb. A solemn silence follows his words. Then from the crowd a cry rises, powerful, irresistible, Deus vult! God wills it. Like a wave sweeping through the multitude, the cry repeats, spreads, swells until it shakes the air. Thousands of voices take up the exclamation. Hands are raised, tears flow. This is no longer merely an assembly. It is a spiritual army taking shape in that moment. Many kneel, strike their chests, swear to take the cross. Some cut pieces of cloth and sew them into crosses on their garments, a sign of their commitment. Others raise their swords to the sky, as if offering them to God. The humblest, peasants or artisans, also pledge to depart, despite their poverty, carried away by the fervor. Chroniclers years later would write that never had such an outpouring been seen. The Pope had transformed fear, anger, and fervor into a single energy, the Crusade. The mightiest knights swore to take the road. Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Antioch. Behind them, vast crowds prepared to leave their lands, convinced that eternal salvation lay at the end of the path. But this call was not heard solely as a spiritual promise. In back rooms, some lords saw an opportunity to gain lands and riches. The East inspired dreams, opulent cities, markets overflowing with spices and silks, gleaming palaces. If God called, why not combine salvation with earthly glory? For the people, it was deliverance. The idea of leaving behind the miseries of daily life to march toward a promised land inflamed hearts. Even if many would never return, the conviction that God himself guided their steps was enough to banish fear. When the council disbanded, Clermont was no longer an ordinary city. It was the origin point of a gigantic movement, a human wave that would soon sweep over the East. In the days that followed, the roads of Auvergne hummed with songs, prayers, and oaths. The crosses sewn onto garments became the standard of a people on the march. The Pope's call had lit a torch, and that torch would set all of Europe ablaze. Part 3. The Crescent and the Cross. While the West ignites with fervor at the Pope's call, at the other end of the Mediterranean stretches a world of immense richness and complexity. There, minarets rise toward the sky, Markets brim with spices, gold, and silks, and scholars study the stars in observatories still unknown to Europe. This is the world of Islam, flourishing but deeply divided. Since the death of the Prophet Muhammad, the Crescent has spread across vast lands, from Spain to the borders of India. But spiritual unity barely conceals political fractures. In the 11th century, two main powers vie for the heart of the Muslim world: the Fatimids of Egypt, heirs to a Shiite tradition, and the Seljuks, Sunni masters from the Turkish steppes, who impose their dominion from the Near East to Anatolia. Between them, Jerusalem is a coveted jewel. The holy city changes hands with the tides of wars and intrigues. The Fatimids sometimes rule it, then are driven out by the Seljuks, only to return in their turn. This instability creates tensions, but also opportunities. For Muslims, Jerusalem is the third holiest city of Islam after Mecca and Medina, the site of the Prophet's night journey, the point of ascension to heaven. The Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock dominate the sacred esplanade, resplendent with mosaics and precious stones. But in this cosmopolitan city, Christians and Jews also live, tolerated in some periods, oppressed in others. Pilgrims from the West can still enter, but at the cost of taxes, dangers, or humiliations. The tale of these hardships, amplified in Europe, becomes the fuel for a sacred anger. To the north, another empire watches: Byzantium. Heir to Rome, the Byzantine Empire stands as a bulwark between the Muslim East and the Latin West. Its capital, Constantinople, still shines with golden domes, colossal walls, and dazzling mosaics. But behind the splendor lies a troubling fragility. For decades, Byzantine emperors have struggled against the advancing Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. The defeat at Manzikert in 1071 marked a turning point. The imperial army was crushed, and much of Anatolia fell under Turkish control. Cities empty, countryside depopulates, and trade routes are threatened. Constantinople, encircled, fears the day its walls will face the cavalry of Islam. It is in this context that Emperor Alexios Komnenos sends ambassadors to Rome. He knows that alone he cannot repel the Seljuk advance, but perhaps the West, galvanized by faith, will come to his aid. For Byzantium, this is a pragmatic call for mercenaries, knights to hold fortresses and push back the enemy. For Rome, it will be the spark that ignites a holy war. Between the Crescent and the Cross, a new tension arises. The West sees in the East both an enemy and a promise. An enemy, because infidels hold the places where Christ lived. A promise, because the lands of the East are rich, fertile, full of treasures that make European lords dream. Maritime routes crossing the Mediterranean become pulsating veins through which merchants and soldiers flow. The Italian republics like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa sense the opportunity. Transporting armies to the east also means opening ports to new markets. Already, merchants prepare their ships, driven by both commercial ambition and religious fervor. In mosques, imams call on the faithful to defend Islam against invaders. But for now, the Muslim world is too divided to unite. Seljuk princes feud among themselves, the Fatimids dream of retaking Jerusalem, and each sees their neighbors as rivals. This fragmentation will be the breach into which the Crusaders will plunge. Yet in the scorching desert air, as in the cool shade of Byzantine domes, an unease already floats. for everything seems to foretell an approaching clash. Pilgrims from the west arrive in growing numbers, their eyes burning with a determination that the inhabitants of the east learn to fear. Eastern monks whisper prophecies, and some Muslim chroniclers will later report strange signs seen in the sky, as if destiny itself announced the arrival of these armed men. In Jerusalem, the bells of Eastern churches still ring, but their echo mingles with the call of the muezzin. The city, shared among three religions, breathes a constant tension. For Eastern Christians, the arrival of a crusade is a promise of liberation, but also a threat of interference. For Muslims, it is an unacceptable intrusion into the land of Islam. For Jews, it is a new fear, for every war places them as hostages between powers. Thus, the stage for the drama is set, a West in search of salvation, a divided but splendid East, a faltering Byzantium, and a tomb of Christ become the stake of the world. The armies have not yet departed, but already, in the air of history, one hears the clash of arms and the chants of prayers. The crescent and the cross, two symbols raised against each other, are about to enter a confrontation that will mark the centuries. Chapter 2. The First Crusade, Blood and Hope. Part 1. The Crusaders on the March. When the echo of Clermont spread through the West, hearts caught fire with a single flame. In villages, towns, and castles, only Jerusalem was spoken of. Itinerant preachers, monks, and hermits roamed the countryside, haranguing crowds. They recounted the suffering of Eastern Christians, the tears of pilgrims, the desecration of holy places. They sometimes displayed wooden crosses planted in the ground, calling men to rally under this standard. Entire families, peasants as well as artisans, thronged churches to swear to depart. The poorest had nothing to offer but their arms, bare feet, and the hope of salvation. The wealthiest sold lands and castles to finance the journey. Lords saw before them a path of glory and perhaps a kingdom. Thus formed what chroniclers called the People's Crusade. Led by fiery preachers like Peter the Hermit, vast crowds set out as early as 1096, well before the organization of seigneurial armies. They were tens of thousands, men, women, children, lacking sufficient arms or provisions, but burning with the certainty that God would guide them. They crossed the Rhine Valley, reached Hungary, then Byzantine lands. But their enthusiasm quickly shattered against the harshness of the journey. Famine, disease, pillaging, massacres, until their near total destruction at the hands of Turkish cavalry in Anatolia. Their sacrifice, seemingly futile, was nonetheless a bloody omen of what awaited those who followed. For behind them, the true seigneurial armies were organizing. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, Raymond of Saint-Gilles, Count of Toulouse, Bohemond of Antioch, heir to the Normans of Italy, and many others raised banners and oaths. These knights, surrounded by their vassals, squires, and foot soldiers, represented the organized might of Christendom. As they advanced, the roads became rivers of humanity. Endless columns could be seen, helmeted knights, chainmail glinting in the sun, banners emblazoned with crosses fluttering in the wind. Behind them marched crowds of pilgrims, carrying sacks and staffs, chanting prayers. Carts creaked under the weight of provisions, barrels, and children. The air resounded with religious hymns, the neighing of horses, the cries of animals dragged along to feed the armies. But this great surge soon collided with realities. Crossing Europe meant crossing borders, traversing lands neither prepared nor willing for this deluge. Local peasants saw these hungry crowds arrive like an invasion. Often famine drove the Crusaders to plunder the villages they passed, sowing fear in their wake. Even churches were looted, fields burned. The march toward God sometimes took on the appearance of earthly desolation. In Constantinople, Emperor Alexios Komnenos watched this flood of Westerners with apprehension. He had hoped for a few thousand knights, but hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children advanced, undisciplined, greedy, carried by a fervor hard to contain. For Byzantium, this was both aid and danger. These fierce, unruly Latins could just as easily turn against the empire as against the Turks. Alexios sought to channel their energy, providing ships and guides to cross the Bosphorus, but also demanding oaths of allegiance. The crossing of Anatolia was hell. The scorching sun, arid plains, and relentless attacks by Seljuk cavalry turned the march into martyrdom. The Crusaders suffered from thirst. Their waterskins emptied. Rivers were scarce. Horses died of exhaustion. Men fell in the sand, their desiccated bodies left to the crows. The Turks, swift, struck through ambushes, harassed the rear, vanished into the dust before they could be reached. And yet, despite the losses, despite the cries of the dying and the weeping of children, the crusade pressed on. The cross sewn onto their garments became for many a burning weight, but also an indelible seal. To retreat was to betray God. To die advancing was to gain heaven. This certainty carried the columns through mountains and steppes. The nights in Anatolia offered a strange spectacle. Under countless stars, Crusader camps spread out like makeshift cities. Thousands of fires glowed, prayers rose in choirs. Priests preached, promising the heavenly Jerusalem to those who persevered. Knights around their fires sharpened their swords, gazing at the horizon where Antioch, the first major step toward the holy city, could already be glimpsed. Tensions also arose among the leaders. Bohemond, ambitious, already saw a kingdom of his own in the east. Raymond, pious and austere, spoke always of pilgrimage before conquest. Godfrey, a figure of chivalric devotion, was seen as a model by his companions. All were united by the cross, but each carried different dreams. The march to Jerusalem was not only a road of dust and blood, it was also an inner journey. Every crusader faced their fears, weaknesses, and desires. Many, amid suffering, had visions, luminous crosses in the sky, angels guiding their steps, inner voices calling them to persevere. Whether real or born of fever, these visions fueled a mystical fervor that transcended the mere logic of battles. When the columns finally approached Antioch, after months of marching, they were but a reduced, gaunt army, tempered by trial. Behind them lay thousands of dead, victims of hunger, disease, or Turkish lances. But before them rose a colossal city, the key to Syria, guarded by immense walls. The march had led them this far. The Crusaders, exhausted but exalted, knew they had just crossed the threshold of a battle that would surpass all they had imagined. Part 2. Antioch, the Infernal City. When the Crusaders caught sight of Antioch, Their hearts tightened between admiration and dread. Before them stood a city unlike any they had seen in the West, colossal, encircled by walls that seemed to touch the sky, bristling with countless towers. The city, built at the foot of the Taurus Mountains, dominated the fertile plain of the Orontes. Its ramparts stretched for miles, climbing hills and winding like a living chain of stone. Antioch was not merely a fortress, it was a capital of the East, a gateway between the Greek and Muslim worlds, an essential step on the road to Jerusalem. The Crusaders, weary from months of marching, knew that if they failed here, their dream would die. But how could they besiege such a city when they already lacked provisions, siege engines, and strength? Yet they pitched their tents, unfurled their banners, and began to encircle Antioch. From the first days, the harshness of the siege made itself felt. Provisions ran low. The surrounding countryside, plundered, could no longer feed tens of thousands of men. Hunger gnawed at bodies, turning Crusaders into wandering specters. Many resorted to eating grass, roots, or boiled leather stripped from their shoes. The famine became so dire that rumors claimed some had tasted the flesh of the dead. Disease added to hunger. The winter cold descended on the camps. Rains turned tents into quagmires, paths into rivers of mud. Fevers and dysentery decimated the armies. Each morning, priests buried rows of corpses while survivors prayed not to be next. And yet, despite exhaustion, assaults on the city continued. The Crusaders tried to build wooden towers, but the lack of materials and the defenders' counterattacks made success nearly impossible. From atop the walls, Muslim archers launched volleys of arrows. Catapults hurled stones that crushed men and machines. The Crusaders below shielded themselves as best they could behind wooden mantlets, but many fell under enemy shafts. The defenders, commanded by Yaghissian, held firm. The governor of Antioch had rallied his troops, and his faith in the city's strength gave him fierce confidence. Every Crusader attack failed. Every breach was sealed. The city seemed invincible. Outside, Seljuk reinforcements approached. Rumors swept through the Christian camps. A vast Muslim army was gathering to crush the siege and liberate Antioch. This threat cast terror among the Crusaders, already starving. Could they even withstand a fresh, disciplined, and numerous army? In the freezing night, around dying fires, the Crusaders sought strength in prayer. Priests exhorted them to hold fast, reminding them that Christ himself had endured hunger and thirst. Some, feverish, claimed to have had visions. They saw St. George riding in the heavens, a blazing cross appearing above the city, or angels promising victory. These dreams, whether true or born of madness, gave courage to men on the brink of despair. Tension mounted further when part of the army nearly disintegrated. Many, discouraged, spoke of abandoning the fight, of returning to the west. But the leaders, Raymond, Bohemond, Godfrey, spoke before their troops. They swore to stay, to die rather than flee. Their determination rekindled their men's flame. Months passed, and the siege seemed eternal. Each day brought the same suffering, the same deaths, the same prayers. But gradually a strategy emerged. Bohemond, cunning and ambitious, began secret negotiations with Firuz, an Armenian commander guarding a section of the walls. The promise of gold and perhaps power convinced Firuz to betray his master. On the night of June 3rd, 1098, a group of Crusaders led by Bohemond advanced silently to the designated rampart. Ladders were raised, and with the traitors' help, they scaled the walls. Darkness shielded them, and soon cries rang out in the city. The gates were opened, and the Crusaders poured in like a tide of iron and fire. Antioch, taken by surprise, was overwhelmed. Fighting raged in the streets. Thousands of inhabitants were massacred. Blood flowed through the alleys, houses were looted, churches reoccupied by the Crusaders. The city, after months of waiting, had finally fallen. But the victory had a bitter taste, for no sooner had Antioch been taken than a vast Seljuk army, led by Kerboga of Mosul, arrived to besiege the Crusaders now trapped within the city. The roles reversed brutally. The besiegers became the besieged. Hunger redoubled, as did fear. It is said that some desperate men fled by night on ropes, abandoning their crosses and oaths. But others held fast, galvanized by an extraordinary discovery. In an Antioch church, a monk claimed to have found the Holy Lance, the one that pierced Christ's side. Was it a true relic or an invention? It mattered little. For the Crusaders, this sign was a certainty. God was with them. When, on June 28th, the Crusaders emerged from the city to face Kerboga, they were exhausted but exalted by their faith. Against all odds, their charge broke the enemy lines. The Seljuk cavalry, surprised by this fury, fled. Antioch was saved, and with it the hope of the Crusade. But this victory came at the cost of unspeakable suffering. The siege of Antioch remained etched as one of the most terrible trials the Crusaders ever endured. An infernal city where hunger, disease, and despair had mingled with faith, betrayal, and miracle. Part 3. Jerusalem, the Tomb, and the Glory. After Antioch, the Crusaders were survivors. Their army, once countless, was now a core of hardened warriors marked by hunger, wounds, and unshakable faith. But behind them, the plains of Anatolia and the walls of Antioch bore witness to their endurance. Before them stood the ultimate goal, Jerusalem. The year 1099 found them marching through Syria and Palestine, skirting burning deserts, crossing hostile villages, sometimes welcomed, more often repelled. Each step brought them closer to the holy city, but each step cost lives. Thirst tormented them above all. The eastern sun crushed their helmets, burned their throats. Many died on the paths, abandoned to the dust. But those who survived pressed on, driven by an inner fire. They knew the tomb of Christ awaited them. In June at last, they glimpsed Jerusalem. The city emerged like a mirage, a crown of walls gilded by the sun, dominated by the shimmering silhouette of the Dome of the Rock, towers and gates rising into the clear sky. The Crusaders, upon seeing the ramparts, fell to their knees. Many burst into sobs. Others began to sing psalms. All knew they had reached the end of their pilgrimage. But Jerusalem was not a city to be taken lightly. It was defended by the Fatimids of Egypt, commanded by Iftikhar ad-Dawla. Its walls were high and thick, its gates firmly bolted. The city had reserves, while the Crusaders had neither provisions, nor siege engines, nor time. For summer approached, and with it the threat of an Egyptian relief army. The siege began in hardship. The Crusaders camped on arid hills without water or food. Thirst devoured them even more than the defenders' arrows. Wells around the city had been poisoned or blocked. Many drank muddy water from puddles or sucked stones to soothe their burning throats. Horses died by the hundreds, swelling with stench under the sun, and yet they persevered. Thanks to Genoese ships arriving at Jaffa, the Crusaders received wood and iron to build machines. Siege towers, battering rams, and catapults took shape under the hands of makeshift carpenters. Every plank, every nail was carried like a relic. They knew these machines were their only hope. The leaders divided the assault. Raymond of Toulouse positioned his tower against the southern gate. Godfrey of Bouillon and Tancred prepared theirs against the northern wall. The days before the attack were marked by mystical fervor. Processions crossed the camp. Priests ordered fasts, confessions, collective prayers. Barefoot, the Crusaders marched around Jerusalem singing hymns, imitating the walls of Jericho. Many believed God himself would bring down the ramparts. On July 14th, the assault began. The plain resounded with the roll of drums, the cry of trumpets, the crash of battering rams. Siege towers, covered with soaked hides, advanced slowly under a hail of arrows and stones. The defenders hurled flaming jars, fiery shafts, enormous rocks. Crusaders fell by the dozens, crushed, burned, pierced. But the human mass advanced, driven by a supernatural will. Night fell, and the assault resumed at dawn. This time, Godfrey's tower reached the walls. Knights climbed, shields raised, lances brandished. The fight raged atop the ramparts, in a chaos of cries, blood, and flames. The Crusaders fought as if possessed, driven by the idea that each blow brought them closer to Christ's tomb. On the morning of July 15, 1099, a breach opened. Godfrey, sword in hand, was among the first to enter the city. Behind him, the Crusaders poured in like a tide. The gates were broken down, cross-emblazoned banners raised on the towers. Jerusalem had fallen. Then began the shadow of this glory. The city was given over to massacre. Christian chronicles themselves speak of streets covered in blood up to the knees. Defenders were slaughtered, inhabitants massacred without mercy. Muslims, Jews, sometimes even Eastern Christians caught in the confusion. The temple was desecrated, synagogues burned, bodies piled up in the alleys. The Crusaders, drunk with victory and vengeance, spared no one. But amid this carnage, one scene remained etched. The Crusader leaders, their weapons still red with blood, went barefoot to the Holy Sepulchre. There, in the solemn silence of Christ's tomb, they prostrated themselves, weeping and praying. Many saw in this terrible contrast the mystery of the Crusade, a war of faith, where blood and prayer mingled in an indissoluble embrace. Jerusalem, after centuries of Muslim rule, had become Christian again. The Crusaders believed they had fulfilled divine will. Their armed pilgrimage ended in glory, but a glory stained with blood. The news spread across Europe like a flame. In churches, bells rang out wildly. Chroniclers spoke of a miracle. The tomb of Christ, finally free, became the beating heart of a new kingdom, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. But this victory carried the seeds of new conflicts. For if Jerusalem had been conquered, it would soon be coveted, besieged, and contested again and again. The cross floated over the walls, but the Crescent had not spoken its last word. Chapter 3. The Latin Kingdoms of the East. Part 1. A new world in the Holy Land. After the capture of Jerusalem, the air of the Near East seemed to vibrate with a new breath. The survivors of the Crusade, once pilgrims in rags, found themselves masters of an inestimable prize, the Holy Land itself. The walls of Jerusalem now bore the cross, and the still fresh blood of battle stained the pavements like an indelible seal. But beyond the exaltation and prayers, a question arose: what to do with this conquest? Quickly, the Crusaders realized they had not come merely to pray at the Holy Sepulchre, but to govern. The East, vast, rich, and complex, could not be held by a few thousand survivors without solid organization. Thus were born the Latin states of the East, the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and above all, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the heart of this new Eastern Christendom. Godfrey of Bouillon, a figure of piety and bravery, was chosen to lead Jerusalem. But he, refusing the title of king in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, took only the title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. This humility struck minds and made him an almost mythical sovereign. Yet behind the symbol, laws had to be established, borders defended, and the population fed. The Crusaders, accustomed to Europe's fields, discovered a world of contrasts. White stone cities, palm-fringed oases, markets overflowing with spices and silks, but also crushing deserts and countless enemies. They learned to know the inhabitants, Eastern Christians, Muslims, and Jews who had lived in these lands for centuries. Many, now under Latin rule, became farmers or artisans for the new lords. Castles began to rise on hills like stars of stone. The Crusaders, aware of their fragility, built colossal fortresses to guard roads and borders: Crac des Chevaliers, Margat, Belvoir, Kerak. So many bastions meant to withstand armies from Damascus, Cairo, or Mosul. Each wall, each tower, was both a refuge and a challenge to the Crescent. In the plains, fields were covered with new crops. European settlers introduced vines and olives, but also learned the secrets of Eastern farmers: irrigation, canals, terraced gardens. Gradually, a hybrid society took shape, blending Latin customs with Eastern influences. Nobles still wore chainmail and heavy cloaks, but some adopted the light fabrics and turbans of the region. In Jerusalem itself, life resumed under a strange light. Pilgrims flocked from the west, crossing seas and deserts to reach the liberated city. In the streets, a mosaic of languages resounded: the Latin of clerics, the French and Occitan of knights, the Greek of Byzantines, the Arabic of locals, Armenian, Syriac. Every square, every market became a crossroads where merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims mingled. But this diversity did not erase tensions. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, tolerated or not depending on the period, lived in fear or resignation. Some fled to lands still held by Islam. Others stayed, working the land or practicing their trades, for daily survival took precedence over religious quarrels. The Latin kingdom, fragile, rested on this precarious balance between domination and coexistence. The kings who succeeded Godfrey, Baldwin I, then Baldwin II, were less modest. They took the title of King of Jerusalem and sought to assert their authority over all the Latin states. They organized lands into fiefs, distributing castles and villages to knights while maintaining central control around Jerusalem. Thus, a feudal society transplanted from the West was recreated in the Holy Land. But every victory already carried a threat. The Latin states were like islands lost in a Muslim ocean. From Damascus to Aleppo, from Cairo to Baghdad, Muslim princes watched these newcomers with unease. For now, their divisions prevented a united response. But sooner or later, these islands would be besieged. The Crusaders knew this. Every procession in the Holy Sepulchre was tinged with foreboding. They had conquered the city at the cost of blood, and more blood would be needed to defend it. Priests preached vigilance. Knights patrolled the roads daily, watching for enemy cavalry already lurking. And yet, despite fear and tension, a kind of wonder persisted. Many Crusaders gazing at Jerusalem's walls bathed in the golden evening light believed they saw a reflection of the heavenly city. They thought God himself had chosen them to guard his tomb. This conviction gave them the strength to endure heat, thirst, and threats. Thus was born this new world in the Holy Land, a kingdom of Crusaders, fragile but radiant, a crossroads of cultures, a permanent battlefield. The West had taken root in the East, and this unlikely graft would endure for nearly 2 centuries at the cost of countless battles. But to survive, these kingdoms needed more than an army. They would soon see the rise of new orders born from the fusion of faith and war, destined to become the guardians of Jerusalem and the main actors in the epic of the Crusades. Part 2. The Templars and the Hospitallers. In the years following the conquest of Jerusalem, the Crusaders quickly realized that their mission could not end with the mere capture of the Holy City. For Jerusalem, though dazzling, remained fragile. The roads leading to sanctuaries remained perilous, and pilgrims continued to be attacked by bandits or Muslim cavalry. The East was not a haven, but a battlefield. From this urgency arose 2 institutions that would mark history: the military orders, an unprecedented fusion of monastic life and chivalry. The first to emerge was the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. Its origins dated back to the decades before the Crusade, when Italian merchants founded a hospice to care for sick pilgrims. After the conquest of Jerusalem, this hospice took on new significance. The Hospitaller brothers welcomed the sick, the wounded, the orphaned. They offered care and rest to those who came to venerate the Holy Sepulchre. But soon, their role went beyond mere charity, for to protect the sick, they also had to wield the sword. The Hospitallers became an armed force, wearing black cloaks marked with a white cross. Their vocation remained twofold: to serve the poor and defend the faith. They built grand hospitals capable of housing hundreds of patients, but also colossal fortresses to hold the borders. Thus, the Hospitaller order became one of the pillars of the Latin state's defense. Soon after, another order emerged, even more mysterious and formidable: the Order of the Temple. Founded around 1119 by Hugh of Paynes and a few companions, it took root on the very esplanade of the Temple of Solomon, from which it drew its name. Their initial mission was simple but essential: to protect pilgrims on the roads. These knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience like monks, but their lives unfolded on battlefields. They wore white cloaks marked with a red cross, a symbol of purity and sacrifice. Their motto was clear: "Not to us, Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory." The Templar rule, written under the influence of Bernard of Clairvaux, exalted a new kind of chivalry, no longer turned toward a personal glory, but entirely devoted to the service of God. For them, killing an infidel was not murder, but a sacred act, a deliverance from Christ's enemies. This radical vision made them a feared and admired army. The two orders were distinguished by their discipline. Where lay knights often followed their passions, the brother knights lived under a strict rule. They ate frugally, prayed at fixed hours, obeyed their masters without question. Their cohesion made them invincible on the battlefield. In battle, the Templars formed the vanguard. They charged fearlessly, united like a wall of iron, breaking enemy lines with their determination. The Hospitallers, meanwhile, often held the rear guard, protecting the wounded and covering retreats. Together, they embodied a new way of fighting, a sanctified chivalry. Their reputation quickly spread beyond the Holy Land. In Europe, donations poured in. Lords gave lands, castles, and riches to the orders, convinced they were buying their salvation. The Templars grew wealthy, building a network of commanderies across the West. The Hospitallers multiplied hospices and fortresses. Thus, the two orders, born in the tumult of the Crusades, became international powers. But their influence was not only military or material. They embodied an idealization of the crusade. For pilgrims, seeing knights in cloaks marked with crosses, praying like monks and fighting like heroes, was living proof that God watched over the Holy Land. They inspired respect, fear, and fervor. Chronicles recount that some Templars, before battles, spent the night in prayer, confessing their sins and taking communion at dawn before mounting their horses. To die sword in hand, with Christ's name on their lips, was for them the ultimate martyrdom. In the decades that followed, Templar and Hospitaller fortresses became the pillars of the Latin kingdom's defense. Crac des Chevaliers, held by the Hospitallers, was an impregnable citadel, rising like a mountain of stone. The Templars controlled strategic strongholds, vital roads, and often served as the close guard of Jerusalem's kings. Without them, the Latin states would have collapsed much sooner. Their discipline and faith gave the kingdom a fragile but real stability. Yet their immense power stirred jealousy and suspicion. Already, some whispered that they served their own interests more than those of Christendom as a whole. At this stage of history, the Templars and Hospitallers were still haloed in glory. They represented the Crusade at its zenith, the fusion of prayer and sword, the image of a Christendom that imagined it could hold Jerusalem forever. In the golden light of Palestinian evenings, one could sometimes see processions of white and black-clad knights marching side by side toward the Holy Sepulchre, their cloaks snapping in the wind, their chants rising like an armed prayer. For pilgrims coming from afar, it was like beholding a heavenly army descended to earth. But behind this aura, time was already working against them, for the fragile balance of the Latin kingdoms could not last indefinitely. The Muslim East, initially divided, would gradually unite. And then even the walls and fervor of the military orders would be put to the test. Part 3. The Fragile Balance. The Latin kingdoms, born in the tumult of the First Crusade, at first seemed solid. like stone bastions planted in the east. But quickly, behind the glory of victories and the fervor of pilgrimages, a darker reality emerged. These states were fragile, vulnerable, perched on the edge of an abyss. Their first challenge was geography. Scattered along the eastern coast, the county of Edessa, the principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and the kingdom of Jerusalem were but thin lines of fortresses separated by vast hostile expanses. Between these Latin enclaves stretched Muslim territories ever ready to flare up. To travel from one castle to another meant braving perilous roads, crossing valleys watched by enemy cavalry. Frankish lords quickly learned that traveling in the east meant risking ambush at every turn. Within the kingdoms themselves, divisions were no less significant. Crusader lords arriving from the west with their lineages and ambitions vied for lands and privileges. Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Antioch, Baldwin of Jerusalem, all sought to expand their influence, sometimes at the expense of unity. Quarrels erupted between counties and principalities, weakening the whole against the common threat. The Latins could not ignore the local populations either. In cities and countryside lived Eastern Christians, Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, but also Muslims and Jews. The new masters imposed their rule, but were never numerous enough to govern alone. They had to compromise, tax, negotiate. The Latins relied on local elites while maintaining a wary distance. This coexistence, fragile, could at any moment turn into revolt. The power of the king of Jerusalem himself remained limited. While Baldwin the Firm and his successors tried to impose their authority over the other states, each jealously guarded its independence. Antioch turned toward the north, and Anatolia felt closer to Byzantium. Tripoli looked to the Mediterranean. Edessa, isolated beyond the Euphrates, was a constant target for neighboring Muslim princes. This dispersion, this lack of unity, made the Latin kingdoms a splendid but fractured edifice. Externally, the danger grew. Islam, initially divided, began to rally. In the courts of Damascus, Aleppo, Cairo, and Baghdad, talk turned to the need for a response. Muslim princes, who had once fought among themselves, began to understand that the common enemy was now in Jerusalem. Time worked against the Latins. To hold on, the Crusaders relied on their fortresses. Everywhere castles arose, high towers, thick walls, garrisons ready to withstand endless sieges. These fortresses were like islands of safety in a hostile ocean, but they were costly to maintain, requiring men, provisions, reinforcements. Europe had to constantly send new crusaders to support these strongholds. And already, echoes from the West showed that the enthusiasm of the First Crusade was not eternal. Tensions also arose between Latins and Byzantines. The Emperor of Constantinople still considered Syria and Palestine as lands rightfully his, but the Latins, proud of their conquests, refused to submit. Mistrust settled between the Crusaders and Byzantium, a mistrust that would later turn into a bloody rupture. In convents and churches, monks observed these fragilities with concern. Pilgrims continued to flock. Processions illuminated Jerusalem, but behind the fervor lurked a quiet unease. How long could they hold out against an innumerable and powerful East? Sermons reminded that only faith could keep the cross atop the walls. But faith was not always enough to fill granaries, pay soldiers, or maintain the discipline of barons. The balance was all the more fragile because every victory carried the seeds of new peril. When a Muslim city fell, its neighbors united to avenge the affront. When a pilgrimage reached Jerusalem, its return risked interception in the desert. Every success invited reprisal. Every conquest called for a siege. Life in the Latin kingdoms was never rest. It was an armed vigil, a time suspended between prayer and war. And yet, despite these dangers, a breath of hope continued to animate the Crusaders. Many still believed Jerusalem was tangible proof that God willed their victory. The Templars and Hospitallers, through their discipline and faith, set the example. Kings and barons, despite their quarrels, knew how to unite when the enemy appeared at the gates. It was this constant tension between division and unity, between fragility and fervor, that kept the edifice standing. Pilgrims arriving at the Holy Sepulchre saw a resplendent Jerusalem, restored, protected by knights in white and black cloaks. But behind this image, the walls were cracked and the future uncertain. The East, vast and powerful, had not yet spoken its last word. Thus ended the first age of the Latin kingdoms, a time of glory and illusion, where the cross shone atop the walls, but where, already, the shadow of future storms stretched over the Holy Land. Chapter 4. The Clash of Titans, Saladin and Richard. Part 1. Hattin, the Desert Inferno. The July sun of 1187 burned like a furnace above the hills of Galilee. The parched fields offered only sparse, yellowed grass, and the wind carried dust and stifling heat. It was there, near the village of Hattin, that the fate of the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was decided. For years, the threat of a great Muslim leader haunted the Latins. That leader now had a name, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, whom the West called Saladin. Son of a Kurdish family, he had, through his bravery and wisdom, united Egypt and Syria under his banner. His piety was exemplary, his generosity legendary, and his military intelligence formidable. Where Muslim princes had once torn each other apart, he united them in a single cause, to retake Jerusalem from the Franks. In contrast, the Latin kingdom was mired in division. King Guy of Lusignan, weak and contested, struggled to impose his authority. The Count of Tripoli, Raymond, ceaselessly challenged his decisions. The Templars and Hospitallers, fierce and proud, pushed for confrontation, and amid these quarrels, an unbearable tension mounted. Saladin had launched his army toward Tiberias, and the Crusaders had to choose, defend or wait. Gathered in council, the barons heatedly debated. Raymond of Tripoli advised caution: stay near water sources, preserve strength, let Saladin exhaust himself. But the most ardent, led by Gerard of Ridefort, master of the temple, cried treason. How could they remain idle while Tiberias, held by Countess Esheva, burned under Muslim assault? Honor demanded action, they said, and God could not abandon his people. The king, hesitant, finally yielded to the most belligerent voices. The army set out, leaving the safety of Sephoria to venture into the arid hills. The march was a torment. The Crusaders, weighed down by their armor, advanced under a merciless sun with almost no water. Their waterskins emptied, their throats parched, their horses stumbled. At every turn Saladin's light cavalry appeared, loosing arrows before vanishing. The column stretched, slowed by thirst and dust. Soon the Crusaders marched like shadows, their banners drooping, their faces pale. On July 3rd, they reached a height near Hattin, dominated by two twin hills called the Horns. There Saladin had set his trap. His troops already encircled the Frankish army, cutting off access to the water of Lake Tiberias. That night, the Crusaders pitched camp. But sleep was impossible. Saladin's archers, positioned all around, harassed the camp with fiery arrows. The wind fanned the dry grass, and soon flames licked the tents, plunging the Christian army into suffocating smoke. Men and beasts choked, thirst becoming torture. At dawn on July 4th, the battle began. The Crusaders, exhausted, tried to rally under their banners. The knights, despite thirst and heat, formed their battle lines, guided by the sacred relic of the true cross carried by cannons. But Saladin had deployed his troops with skill. His mounted archers encircled the Franks, riddling them with arrows. Muslim cavalry, swift and free, swirled around the army like a swarm. The Crusaders' heavy, disorganized charges failed to break through. Each attempt shattered against the shifting sea of enemy cavalry. The Templars and Hospitallers, though seasoned, exhausted themselves in futile assaults. Heat and smoke broke their morale. Men fell from thirst before even fighting. In the heart of the melee, banners fell one by one. The cries of "God wills it" were lost in the tumult. The true cross itself was captured by Saladin's men, stripping the Franks of their last hope. The knights, surrounded, fought to their last ounce of strength, but disaster was inevitable. King Guy was taken prisoner. The great barons fell into enemy hands. Gerard of Ridefort, master of the temple, survived but had to watch, powerless, as his brothers were executed. The captured Templars and Hospitallers were put to death on Saladin's orders, for their oath bound them never to surrender. The ground at Hattin was littered with corpses, the ashes of burned grass mingling with the blood of knights. Saladin's victory was total. The Frankish army, annihilated, left the kingdom of Jerusalem defenseless. The roads opened to Muslim cavalry. Acre, Caesarea, Jaffa, Ascalon fell one after another. Fortresses surrendered without resistance, for there was no army left to defend them. And in October 1187, the inevitable came. Jerusalem itself, the long-contested city, was besieged by Saladin. The city, deprived of relief, could not hold. But this time, unlike the massacre of 1099, Saladin showed clemency. Christian inhabitants were allowed to ransom their freedom, and the holy city passed once more under the Crescent. The news spread like lightning in Europe. The Christian world, stunned, learned that Jerusalem was lost. Bells tolled the knell in cathedrals, crowds fell to their knees, and Western kings swore to take the cross in turn. Thus, from the disaster of Hattin would arise a new crusade, even vaster, led by sovereigns themselves, the Third Crusade. But on the hill of Hattin, amid ashes and bones, history had turned. The Latin kingdom had lost its heart, and the cross, burned by the desert Inferno, was pushed back by the victorious Crescent. Part 2. The Lion and the Sultan. The loss of Jerusalem shook Europe like thunder. In cathedrals, crowds wept, monks preached God's vengeance, and kings, this time, took the cross themselves. The German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa set out with a vast army but drowned, crossing an Anatolian river. The French king, Philip Augustus, raised his banners, but it was above all the English king, Richard Plantagenet, who would mark history. An indomitable warrior, a bold strategist, he bore a name that still resonates, Coeur de Lion. Richard was everything a knight dreamed of being, tall, strong, blazing with courage, and almost reckless in bravery. His voice carried like a trumpet, his sword struck like lightning. Upon his arrival in the east, he already made enemies tremble. The west had found its champion. Facing him, Saladin, master of Islam, asserted a different strength. Calm, reflective, imbued with piety and wisdom, he commanded not only through fear, but above all through respect. One was fire, the other the serenity of water, and from their encounter would arise an epic. In 1191, Richard landed at Acre, a port under siege by Crusaders for 2 years. His arrival changed everything. With furious energy, he ordered relentless assaults, erected siege engines, and launched his knights against the walls. Saladin, trying to support the garrison, watched with concern the vigor of this new king. Finally, Acre fell. The banners of the cross flew over the towers, and Richard's reputation blazed in the east. But the shadow of the massacre of Muslim prisoners, executed by the thousands for lack of ransom, already weighed on his glory. The path to Jerusalem opened, but to reach it, the plains of Palestine had to be crossed where Saladin's army waited. This led to the march to Arsuf, one of the most famous moments of the Crusade. Saladin, master of harassment tactics, sent his light cavalry against the Frankish columns. Day after day, Muslim archers riddled the Crusaders with arrows, seeking to break their formation. But Richard imposed iron discipline. The knights had to restrain their ardor, not charge too soon, maintain cohesion. As fatigue wore down the ranks, the danger of collapse grew immense. But at the decisive moment, Richard gave the signal. The knights lowered their lances and, in a thunderous crash, launched their charge. The Crusaders, united like a living wall, smashed into the Muslim lines. The shock was terrible. Saladin saw his troops reel under the fury of the Western Knights. Arsuf was a dazzling victory for Richard, and the warrior king's prestige soared further. But despite this victory, Jerusalem remained out of reach. Richard understood that holding the city would require more than bravery. It demanded provisions, reinforcements, logistics that the West struggled to provide. Twice he approached the walls of the holy city. Twice he resolved not to besiege it, fearing to lose what he had gained. To his knights, this caution seemed like betrayal. But Richard knew that taking Jerusalem without being able to hold it would be a disaster. Between Richard and Saladin, the confrontation soon took on the air of a symbolic duel. They never met face to face, but their names echoed like two reflections. Richard, flamboyant, multiplied exploits. It is said he felled cavalrymen with a single blow, that his presence alone sufficed to galvanize his troops. Saladin, meanwhile, embodied a different grandeur, that of patience, diplomacy, even respect for his enemy. Legends already circulated recounting the courtesy between the two men. It was said that Saladin, learning Richard was ill, sent him fresh fruits and snow to ease his fever. It was whispered that the Sultan so admired his adversary's courage that he offered his personal physician to treat him. Whether these tales were embellished matters little. They reflect the mutual admiration these two giants inspired. The crusade continued in battles, negotiations, and ruses. Richard retook Jaffa, consolidating the Frankish coast, but never Jerusalem. Saladin, despite setbacks, held the essential. The holy city remained Muslim. The two leaders, after years of effort, realized neither could fully defeat the other. Thus was born a rivalry of a unique kind, not made solely of hatred, but also of respect. Richard was the roaring lion, striking with all his might. Saladin, the wise sultan, absorbing blows and protecting Jerusalem. Their confrontation, more than a war, became a legend recounted by Western troubadours and Eastern poets. When, in 1192, a truce was concluded, the Crusaders had to accept a painful reality. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims could once again enter the city, visit the Holy Sepulchre, pray in the sanctuaries. Saladin, magnanimous, granted this concession, preferring peace to endless war. Richard, exhausted, had to return to England, leaving behind an unfinished crusade. And yet, in memory, this crusade was not a failure, for it had given the world the image of two colossal figures, opposed yet linked. The Crusader king with the heart of a lion and the pious, generous sultan. Their duel became a parable of history. The clash of civilizations could engender not only violence, but also a form of esteem and grandeur. In the twilight of their lives, each remained true to his image. Richard died a few years later, struck by a crossbow bolt before a French castle. Saladin passed away in Damascus in 1193, leaving behind a legacy of justice and piety. On his tomb, it was said he left only a few gold coins, proof that he had lived and ruled without amassing wealth. Thus ended the duel of the lion and the sultan. Jerusalem remained Muslim, but the legend of their confrontation crossed centuries, like a tale where iron and faith, glory and wisdom faced off. Part 3. Neither Victor nor Vanquished. The year 1192 opened on a Palestine torn but ever indomitable. 3 years of battles, sieges, and cavalry charges had marked the Third Crusade. Richard Coeur de Lion, despite his dazzling victories, could not reach Jerusalem. Saladin, despite his tenacity, failed to push the Crusaders back to the sea. Both had given all that bravery, cunning, and faith could offer, but neither the Cross nor the Crescent had fully triumphed. For the Frankish knights, the bitterness was great. Twice, Richard had led his army to the gates of Jerusalem. Twice, he had turned back. The Crusaders looked at him with admiration, but also frustration. They had seen him shatter Saladin's lines at Arsuf, retake Jaffa with a daring stroke worthy of epic songs, but they had never breached the walls of the holy city. In the camps, some whispered that the King of England, despite his nickname, had lacked faith. Others, more clear-sighted, understood that Richard had not wanted to sacrifice his men in a hopeless siege. On the Muslim side, Saladin's troops were equally exhausted. Since Hattin and the reconquest of Jerusalem, the Sultan had raced from one battle to another. His resources were dwindling, his allies growing weary of war. His cavalry, though still formidable, had suffered under the relentless discipline of the Frankish knights. The war, which had begun as an irresistible crusade, had become an exhausting stalemate. So the two great leaders resolved to speak of peace. It was a strange truce with diplomats and emissaries moving between camps. Gifts were exchanged: horses, rare fruits, precious fabrics. It is said that Richard, admiring the skill of Muslim blacksmiths, received a finely crafted sword, while Saladin, hearing of the king's musical talents, sent for a harp. Such stories, embellished by chroniclers, reflect less reality than the image one wished to preserve, that of a noble, almost brotherly rivalry. In September 1192, the agreement was sealed. The Crusaders retained a coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa, ensuring the fragile survival of the Latin kingdoms. Christian pilgrims were allowed to enter Jerusalem freely, to venerate the Holy Sepulchre, to pray in the sanctuaries. But the city remained under Muslim rule. For Richard, it was a defeat disguised as a compromise. He had dreamed of being the king who restored Jerusalem to Christendom, but he departed without touching its walls. For Saladin, it was an incomplete victory. He had held Jerusalem, but he could not drive the Crusaders from the entire coast. Each had preserved the essential. Each had yielded a share of their ambitions. When Richard embarked for the west, his men wept. Many would never see the holy city again. The king, leaving those shores, turned his gaze one last time toward Jerusalem, invisible beyond the horizon. Chronicles report that he swore to return, but his destiny awaited him elsewhere, in the quarrels of France and England. Saladin, for his part, returned to Damascus. He was victorious, but worn. The following year, in 1193, he died, leaving behind an immense legacy. On his tomb, his kin placed 3 banners. One spoke of his glory, another his faith. The last recalled that he left behind only a few silver coins, proof of his modesty. Thus ended this extraordinary duel, neither victor nor vanquished. Richard, the flamboyant king, and Saladin, the wise Sultan, had clashed like two giants. They had failed to break each other entirely, but their legend had grown beyond the walls of Jerusalem. In the West, troubadours still sang of Coeur de Lion's exploits, his courage, and his fire. In the East, poets praised Saladin's justice and piety. Peoples, even separated by faith, united in admiration for these two figures. History had opposed them, but memory linked them as if their greatness was inseparable. The crusade itself left a bitter taste. The Crusaders had failed to retake Jerusalem, but they had consolidated a presence in the Holy Land. The Muslims had held the Holy City, but at the cost of titanic efforts. The spilled blood seemed to lead to a simple truth. Neither side could erase the other. From this impasse arose a fragile balance. Pilgrimages resumed, Latin ports continued to welcome ships and goods. But beneath this apparent peace, tension persisted. For neither the West nor the East had forgotten Jerusalem. The holy city remained the object of a burning desire, a wound never healed. The time of heroes was ending, but that of new crusades approached. For if Richard and Saladin had embodied the nobility of an almost legendary duel, their heirs would soon rekindle the flames, sometimes without their grandeur, but with the same intensity. And so this chapter of history closed, an unfinished crusade, an imperfect truce, but an immortal memory. Neither victor nor vanquished. Only two names etched in the marble of centuries, two silhouettes opposed yet linked, whom history will never cease to make converse. Chapter 5, The Shadow of the Last Crusades. Part 1, The Fourth Crusade and the Fall of Constantinople. When the Crusade of Richard and Saladin ended, the West remained torn between hope and bitterness. Jerusalem stayed under the Crescent, but the Frankish port survived, fragile bastions on the Mediterranean coast. The popes, however, did not relent. For them, the Crusade remained the supreme tool of Christian unity, the impetus capable of transcending the quarrels of kings and lords. Thus, at the end of the 12th century, a new call was issued, a Fourth Crusade, intended to strike the heart of Islam, to reconquer Jerusalem, and to restore the glory of the cross. But from its outset, this crusade took a tortuous path. The Crusaders, mainly French and Flemish barons, had sworn to depart, but their endeavor lacked resources. To cross the sea and reach the east, they needed ships. They turned to Venice, a formidable merchant republic. The aged Doge Enrico Dandolo, nearly blind but cunning, agreed to provide a vast fleet in exchange for a colossal price. When the Crusaders gathered in Venice, they realized they were too few to pay their debt. Then Dandolo proposed a deal. If they helped him retake the rebellious city of Zara on the Adriatic, the Republic would defer payment. The Crusaders, hesitant but constrained, agreed. Thus, for the first time, a crusade turned from its sacred mission to attack a Christian city. Zara fell in 1202 under the Crusaders' banners. The Pope, furious, excommunicated the entire army. But the momentum was launched, and destiny would push this deviation even further, for in Venice, a Byzantine prince in exile appeared, Alexios Angelos, son of a deposed emperor. He promised the Crusaders immense riches, reinforcements, and the submission of the Greek Church to Rome, if only they helped him retake Constantinople. This offer was irresistible to Crusaders burdened with debt. Venice, ever greedy for trade, saw the chance to control eastern routes. The expedition meant to go to Jerusalem, thus set sail for Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. The city still shone, grander and richer than any Western capital. Its walls rose like mountains of stone, its churches dazzled with golden mosaics, its markets overflowed with silks and spices. But the Byzantine Empire, weakened by intrigues and quarrels, was faltering. The Crusaders, supported by the Venetian fleet, camped before the colossal walls in 1203. The first assault, against all odds, succeeded. The Crusaders gained a foothold in the city, installed Alexios on the throne, and demanded their due. But Constantinople, exhausted by taxes, revolted. Alexios was overthrown and killed, and the Crusaders, now without an ally, faced a hostile city. Then, in April 1204, they launched a full assault. What followed remains one of the darkest wounds in Christian history. Constantinople, the queen of cities, was given over to pillage for 3 days. Knights broke down palace doors, carried off relics, gold, and ancient treasures. Churches were desecrated, the great sanctuary of Hagia Sophia stained with blood and mud. Millennia-old statues were melted down to mint coins. Inhabitants were massacred, enslaved, or forced to flee. The city, jewel of the Greek world, was reduced to ashes and ruins. The Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, but their triumph was already a curse, for in striking Byzantium, they had shattered the last bulwark of Eastern Christendom. The Byzantine Empire, weakened and humiliated, would never fully recover. The rift between the Greek East and the Latin West became irreversible. For Muslims, this catastrophe was an unexpected relief, for instead of marching on Jerusalem, the Crusaders had torn each other apart, destroying their own faith's unity. The holy city remained far from their reach, protected by their adversaries' disorder. For Europe, the news of Constantinople's sack resounded like a betrayal. Many saw it as a sign that the crusade had been corrupted, diverted from its ideal to serve gold and political ambition. Others, conversely, rejoiced at the riches brought back. But none could deny that the spirit of the First Crusade, a pure surge of fervor, had darkened in the flames of Constantinople. Such was the tragic irony. A crusade proclaimed to save Jerusalem had struck the very heart of Christendom. The Crusaders had triumphed, but this triumph already heralded the end of their epic. For, with Byzantium in ruins, the Latin kingdoms of the East lost their most powerful ally, and Islam soon would seize this fracture to strike in turn. Thus, in the charred streets of Constantinople, among corpses and scattered relics, the shadow of the last Crusades began to spread. This was no longer the time of pure ardor, but of thwarted ambitions, betrayals, and disillusionments. Part 2. St. Louis, the Crusader King. By the mid-13th century, the ardor of the early Crusades had waned. The Latin kingdoms, reduced to a thin coastal strip, lived under the constant threat of Egypt's sultans. Europe, weary of costly wars and disillusionments, began to turn its eyes from the Holy Land. But one king in France embodied a final flame of fervor and piety, Louis IX, whom history would later call St. Louis. Born in 1214, Louis was raised in intense faith. His mother, Blanche of Castile, told him that preferring to lose life rather than commit a single mortal sin was the path to salvation. Becoming king at 12, Louis grew up with the idea that his power was a sacred burden, a mission entrusted by God. His piety struck his contemporaries. He fasted, prayed long hours, dispensed justice with equity, and became the protector of the poor and sick. But in his heart burned a great desire to liberate Jerusalem. In 1244, dire news reached the West. Jerusalem, briefly returned to the Crusaders by treaty, fell back into Muslim hands after an invasion by the Khwarezmians. The emotion was immense, and Louis IX saw it as a sign. In 1248, after recovering from a grave illness, he vowed to embark on a crusade if he survived. For him, it was a divine mission. He gathered an army in France and set sail from Aigues-Mortes, a newly developed Mediterranean port. His destination was not Jerusalem, but Egypt. For the king's advisors believed that striking at the heart of Muslim power meant attacking the Ayyubid Sultanate controlling Cairo. Egypt was the granary of the East, the strategic key to then reconquering the Holy Land. The crusade began with a dazzling success. In 1249, the Crusaders seized Damietta, an Egyptian port on the Nile Delta. The entry into the city was triumphant. Fleur-de-lis banners snapped in the wind, and the king himself, dressed in a simple white tunic, walked barefoot in a sign of humility. His men saw in him a leader not only courageous but holy. Everything seemed to herald a brilliant victory. But the euphoria did not last. The Crusader army ventured inland, following the Nile's course. The stifling climate, marshes, and diseases struck the soldiers hard. The Egyptians, led by the future Sultan Baybars, harassed the Crusaders with formidable tactics. Then came the catastrophe. At Mansoura, the Crusaders were trapped. The Templars, impatient, charged without waiting for the main army and fell into an ambush. The city's streets became a deadly trap, and the knights were cut to pieces. Louis IX, despite the disaster, remained admirably brave. Captured by the Egyptians after an epidemic decimated his ranks, he was taken prisoner. It is said he maintained an impressive dignity, praying and encouraging his companions even in chains. Finally, against a ransom, he was freed and allowed to leave Egypt. The crusade could have ended there, but Louis refused to give up. He stayed several years in the Holy Land, residing in Saint-Jean d'Acre. There, he strengthened fortifications, organized the administration of the Latin states, and tried to negotiate with Muslim princes. Though he did not retake Jerusalem, he left a profound impression through his piety and uprightness. Even Muslims saw in him a different kind of king, just, sincere, devoted to his faith. In 1254, he returned to France. Many would have abandoned the dream of crusade after such an ordeal, but not Louis IX. 20 years later, he took the cross again, despite his advanced age. This time, he chose Tunis in North Africa as his target. Some said he wanted to convert the local sultan, others that he saw this expedition as a step toward Egypt. Whatever the case, in 1270, he embarked once more, taking his sons and knights with him. But this final crusade turned into tragedy. Barely arrived before Tunis, the army was struck by an epidemic, likely dysentery. Soldiers fell by the hundreds, unable to endure the heat and lack of potable water. The king himself was afflicted. Lying on his cot in a tent, battered by the scorching wind, Louis IX felt his end nearing. He asked for the Psalms to be read to him, prayed until his last breath, and died, pronouncing the name of Jerusalem. The news of his death shook Christendom. Many saw in him not only a king, but a true saint, a martyr of the crusade. Processions took place across Europe, and a century later he was canonized. And yet, despite his sanctity, his crusades were military failures. Neither Egypt nor Tunisia fell to the Crusaders. Jerusalem remained under Muslim rule. But the image of Louis IX remains that of a king who, to the end, embodied the Crusader ideal, the fusion of faith, justice, and courage. His failures also mark the end of a cycle. The West no longer had the strength or unity of the early Crusades. Dreams of glory shattered against the realities of desert and disease. Fervor turned to nostalgia, and the epic of the Crusades neared its twilight. Part 3. Twilight and Memory. After the death of Louis IX before Tunis, the Crusader dream faded little by little. The fervor that had inflamed Europe in the 11th century had dulled. The great Western monarchies, now preoccupied with their internal wars and dynastic rivalries, no longer had the strength to launch vast expeditions to the East. Crusades continued in fits and starts, through isolated efforts, but the original fervor had dissipated. In the Holy Land, the Latin kingdoms shrank like a fading shadow. Once masters of Jerusalem, Antioch, and vast territories by the late 13th century, The Crusaders held only a narrow coastal strip. The great city of Saint-Jean d'Acre had become the capital of what remained of the Latin kingdom. A cosmopolitan and fortified city, it still buzzed with languages and faces from across Europe and the East. Its streets saw Genoese, Venetian, and Pisan merchants, soldier monks, weary pilgrims, and diplomats trying to save the impossible. But Acre lived in an illusion of security. All around, the Mamluk Sultanate, born in Egypt, grew in power. The Mamluks, slaves turned soldiers, then masters, formed a formidable army. Their discipline and martial zeal made them invincible. Under Sultan Baybars first, then his successors, they methodically retook every Frankish stronghold until they encircled the last bastions. In 1291, the final storm broke. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil launched a vast army against Acre. The walls, though mighty, could not withstand indefinitely the tide of soldiers, catapults, and siege engines. Assaults followed in the thunder of stones, flames, and cries. The Templars and Hospitallers, the last guardians of the Crusader ideal, fought with desperate bravery. It is said their cloaks, white and black, were covered in dust and blood, but they continued to brandish the cross until the final moment. The city, overwhelmed, was given over to massacre. Streets were strewn with corpses, churches destroyed, palaces burned. Survivors fled by sea, crammed into ships, leaving the port under enemy fire. Acre, the last Latin stronghold in the Holy Land, collapsed in smoke and pain. Thus ended 2 centuries of Christian presence in the East. The Crusaders, who had once conquered Jerusalem in the fury of 1099, were now driven out, reduced to memories. The dream of a Latin kingdom in the Holy Land vanished. And yet the Crusades did not truly die. Their spirit lived on in memories, sermons, and songs. In the West, chroniclers still recounted the knight's exploits, the glory of Clement, Richard's victories, St. Louis' virtues. Troubadours sang epics, idealizing war sometimes bloody and cruel into tales of fervor and nobility. In the East, the memory was quite different. The Crusades remained the recollection of invaders from afar who had plundered, massacred, and desecrated. But the figure of Saladin, just and magnanimous, rose as a heroic protector of Islam, a symbol of regained unity against the foreigner. For Muslims, the final victory over the Crusaders was a sign that God had protected his land. The Crusades also left unexpected legacies. They opened trade routes, brought East and West closer through the exchange of spices, silks, and knowledge. Crusaders brought back discoveries in medicine, architecture, and philosophy. Italian cities, enriched by maritime trade, became the cradles of a prosperity that would lead to the Renaissance. But these benefits could not erase the terrible cost. Millions of lives shattered, hatreds accumulated, deep wounds between Eastern and Western Christians, between Islam and Europe. When bells tolled in Europe to announce Acre's fall, it was like a knell. Processions filled with tears, but no one raised an army strong enough to change destiny. The Crusades to the Holy Land were over. Other holy wars would continue elsewhere, in Spain against the Moors, in the Baltic against pagans. But the dream of Jerusalem now belonged to the past, and yet this past never ceased to inhabit the imagination. Knights in shining armor under the eastern sun, banners snapping in the wind, processions to the Holy Sepulchre, the duels of Richard and Saladin, all became legend. a legend where history and myth intertwine, where faith and blood merge. Thus, the Crusades were not merely wars. They were a mirror in which each civilization saw its own face. For the West, they symbolized the ardor of faith and the quest for salvation, but also the temptation of wealth and power. For the East, they represented aggression and trial, but also the victory of unity and resistance. The twilight of the Crusades was thus not an end, but a memory, a painful, glorious, contradictory memory that crossed centuries. In the churches of France, prayers were still offered for knights fallen in the Holy Land. In the mosques of Cairo or Damascus, the victories of Saladin and the Mamluks were still praised. And in the ruins of Acre, battered by the sea wind, the broken stones seemed to still whisper the chants of processions, the cries of battles, the prayers of the dying. There an epic ended, but there a legend began. For if the Crusaders had lost the Holy Land, they had gained an eternal place in the history of men. In this tale where fervor and madness, light and shadow, always walk side by side. The First Crusade saw the Crusaders seize Jerusalem in 1099. Carried by Urban II's call and guided by leaders like Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse. The Second Crusade, led by Louis VII and Conrad III, ended in failure and disillusionment, leaving the East still divided but resilient. The Third Crusade, dazzling and dramatic, pitted two giants against each other, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. The battles of Arsuf and Jaffa marked history, but Jerusalem remained Muslim, despite the Crusaders' bravery. Finally, the Fourth Crusade, diverted by Venetian ambition, turned away from the Holy Land to strike Constantinople, plunging Christendom into shame and division. 4 Crusades, 4 tales blending faith and steel, glory and disaster. Names still shine in memory: Godfrey, Barbarossa, Richard, Saladin, Dandolo, and behind them, entire peoples, pilgrims, and knights died for an ideal, died for Jerusalem. But the story does not end there, for in the 13th century, other kings, other armies, other military orders would still raise the cross. This would be the time of St. Louis, the Mamluks, the fall of Acre, and the twilight of the Latin kingdoms. But amid this epic, certain individual destinies rise like flames. In the shadow of kings and popes, one man stood alone against the inevitable. When Saladin's army surrounded Jerusalem after the defeat at Hattin in 1187, it was Balian of Ibelin, a Frankish lord of the Holy Land, who took up the defense of the holy city. With a few hundred knights and desperate civilians, he held his ground against the Crescent, negotiated with the Sultan, and saved the population from a massacre. It was he who embodied, at the heart of the fall, dignity and resistance. His name is less known than that of the great kings, but his story is a legend. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through history. I hope this tale has brought you peace and wonder. Don't forget to subscribe to Twilight Tales for more stories to guide you into a serene sleep. Take care and see you soon.